Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something a little soft, a little dim, and just eerie enough to make your brain quiet down instead of spinning in circles like a confused hamster. So go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Flop onto whatever pillow situation you've assembled. Maybe you're listening with one ear because the other one is smushed against the blanket. It's fine. This is not that kind of lecture where you need to take notes. Tonight, we're drifting into one of those corners of Greek myth that never makes the flashy highlight reels. It's not Zeus turning into a swan, or a golden shower, or yet another unfortunate object lesson in why the Olympians needed centuries of therapy. No, tonight we gently float toward Hecate, quiet, torch-bearing, crossroads haunting Hecate, whose job seems to be guiding anyone who wandered a little too far after sunset. And in the ancient world, that was almost everyone because street lamps were not exactly a thing. So let's take a slow breath and wander into it. Hecate is one of those figures who somehow exists on the periphery of Greek mythology, like the quiet coworker who actually knows how everything works, but everyone else keeps ignoring her while they set their own desks on fire. She's old, older than the Olympians, older than the myths that even remembered to write her name down. She shows up when the stories need her, and then she vanishes, carrying one of her famous torches, lighting the way for whichever unfortunate soul made the questionable life choice of traveling at night. Ancient Greeks believed that wandering after dark was pretty much asking for trouble. The landscapes were rugged, the paths were narrow, and someone inevitably drank too much diluted wine during dinner. This is the environment in which Hecate's torches became a kind of mythological flashlight, reliable, steady, and possibly judging you for not heading home earlier. But before we get into her nightly duties, we should drift back, slowly and gently, through the centuries, toward her earliest origins. Because, classic Greek mythology moment, nobody agrees where Hecate actually came from. Some say she was the daughter of Perses and Asteria, which sounds reasonable enough. Others imply she came from a much older, pre-Greek layer of religious imagination. The kind of layer where gods are a little weirder, a little more mysterious, and definitely less standardized. Her name itself is a soft hiss, Hecate, the kind of name you whisper when holding a candle in a hallway and pretending you're not spooked by a slight draft. Hecate was associated with thresholds, liminal spaces, crossroads, doorways, and everything between one thing and another. She's basically the goddess of transitional awkwardness, standing patiently with her torches while humans try to navigate the existential equivalent of, so, do we hug or wave? The Greeks loved their crossroads imagery, especially at night. A crossroads wasn't just a place to choose between left or right. It was a spot where normal rules thinned out a little. Travelers felt uncertain. Shadows pooled strangely. Animals made noises that sounded suspiciously like supernatural beings. And if you did run into someone there after midnight, there was about a 50% chance it was not a living person at all. Enter Hecate, patroness of the nightlit intersection and subtle beacon of, maybe try not to panic. She wasn't frightening, though, at least not originally. She was protective. The kind of protective where she guided you, not with dramatic fanfare, but with the patient glow of two torches held steadily above the darkness. And she wasn't just guiding people physically, though that was certainly part of her job. She guided choices too. Crossroads are metaphors, obviously. Ancient Greeks used them to symbolize the various decisions that turn life into either a mildly interesting scroll or a full-blown tragedy. But let's drift calmly into the more practical side of things. Greek travelers at night genuinely needed help. Imagine walking on rocky paths, in the pitch black, with wild animals whispering congratulations on your poor decision-making abilities. That is exactly the kind of situation where a goddess with flaming torches would be extremely welcome. Sure, these myths were symbolic, but they were also a comforting bedtime story for people who still had to go out and fetch water or firewood after the sun went down. And Hecate was versatile. One moment she was appearing to lost shepherds, helping them find their flock before wolves turned it into a midnight buffet. The next, she might be guiding women in childbirth, illuminating the dark threshold between life and life, because birth itself was another kind of crossroads. She was a goddess of many small, steady lights. Not dazzling sunshine. Not the dramatic flair of Apollo's absolute need to be the center of attention. Just quiet, warm torches, like twin lanterns held by someone who actually cares whether you stub your toe. Her torches turn up everywhere in her early depictions. Sometimes she holds one in each hand. Sometimes she is shown with 3 bodies, each holding a torch, because the Greeks loved making things symbolically overcomplicated. The triple-bodied version isn't as weird as it sounds. It represents Hecate watching all 3 directions of a crossroads at once. Very practical. Imagine her as the world's calmest security system, monitoring everything with a gentle glow and absolutely zero enthusiasm for chasing anyone. And those torches weren't just symbols. Greeks genuinely lit real torches in her honor, especially on the nights when they feared spirits wandering the streets. If you ever want to imagine an ancient Greek bedtime routine, picture farmers and fishermen stepping outside, holding small flames, and muttering tiny prayers to Hecate so that nothing ethereal would follow them home. It's actually kind of sweet in a mildly anxious way. But Hecate's guiding abilities were particularly important in the underworld stories. She had a special connection to the realms below, a calm, supervisory anti-vibe, rather than the dramatic doom and gloom aesthetic some gods preferred. Hecate walked the boundary between earth and underworld, carrying her torches into places where light didn't naturally belong. She could move between worlds without fuss, without needing anyone's permission, and without making a big spectacle. When Persephone was abducted, Hecate was the one who heard her cries echoing from somewhere deep. While the rest of the Olympians were being their usual oblivious selves, Hecate followed the sound, torchlight slicing gently through the gloom, and she stayed with Demeter during the long search. She even continued guiding Persephone each time she moved between the realms afterward, a kind of mythological escort service with excellent lighting. But let's float back toward the roads. Those ancient roads were not like modern ones. They didn't have signs, or lamps, or Instagram influencers posing inconveniently in the middle of them. They were basically dirt paths edged with stones that may or may not trip you when you least expected it. Travelers timed their journeys around daylight because walking at night was the mythological equivalent of selecting the hard mode option. Still, life happens, plans change, and the sun doesn't always cooperate with your schedule. When darkness fell early or unexpectedly, people whispered Hecate's name like a reassurance. She was the goddess whose torches defined the safe edges of the world. Her light wasn't bright, but steady. Not a lighthouse beam cutting dramatically through storms, just 2 small flames saying, "Calm down. You're fine. Just keep walking." And here's one of the charming little details. Dogs were sacred to Hecate. In myth, dogs would howl when she passed by, not out of fear, but recognition. You can imagine a traveler hearing a distant dog barking in the dark and thinking, either that's a goddess turning up, or someone dropped a goat carcass again. Either way, it added atmosphere. Ancient writers loved to mention the dogs, always as the first sign she was near. Her approach was never silent. It was a mix of soft torchlight and the faint, echoing howl of a canine choir. But why torches? Why not a lantern? Or, something that didn't require constant vigilance to avoid burning off your own eyebrows? The answer is simply, torches look cool. And they're one of the oldest forms of portable light. In the ancient world, they symbolized warmth, safety, presence, and illumination, both literal and metaphorical. Hecate's torches illuminated choices. They illuminated the path. They illuminated the edges where the mortal and immortal worlds brushed against each other. And honestly, they illuminated the fact that humans, even in ancient times, were constantly wandering off the path and needing supernatural help to get back on track. Some things never change. Even in literature, torchlight has a sleepy rhythm to it. The soft flicker, the smell of burning pitch, the way flames bend just a little when someone breathes. You can imagine Hecate holding those steady, unwavering torches, guiding travelers who bumped along the road half asleep, trying not to step on snakes, rocks, or their own regrets. Her calm presence at midnight crossroads became so iconic that later traditions expanded her role. Suddenly, she became associated with magic, witchcraft, herbal knowledge, and the kind of moonlit secret rites that frankly sound a lot less dramatic when you imagine everyone whispering because they didn't want to wake the neighbors. But beneath all the later mythological layering, Hecate never lost her torches. They were the core of her identity, the quiet flame that said, "You're lost, but not abandoned." She wasn't flashy like Hermes, who zipped around delivering messages and occasionally stealing cows just to stay entertained. She wasn't judgmental like Hera, whose personality can be summarized as a divine cluster of repressed irritation. And she wasn't chaotic like Dionysus, whose entire vibe is, "Let's make questionable decisions with grapes." Hecate was steadier, softer, watching humans navigate the literal and symbolic darkness of their lives. And her torches weren't just for dramatic myth moments. They were used in household rituals. Families left offerings to her, especially at crossroads, hoping she would discreetly sweep away whatever unwelcome spirits were lurking nearby. When nights felt heavy, or when someone in the home was anxious, families lit small lamps or torches in her honor, not as a spectacle but as a request for guidance. They wanted her calm light, her steady presence, her quiet way of helping without demanding attention. So tonight, as we drift through the labyrinth of her stories, we're following that same soft glow. Not a spotlight, not a firestorm, just a small, warm flame carried by a goddess who knew every hidden path, every lonely traveler, every uncertain choice. And with that, let's gently drift toward another moment in her mythic wanderings, another royal disaster waiting politely for our attention. Hecate's torches weren't just for farmers, wanderers, or shepherds drifting home after dark. They also found their way into the quieter stories of kings, especially the kings who were more lost emotionally than geographically. And there were many. Greek mythology is basically a portfolio of powerful men who had no idea what they were doing, pretending everything was fine while absolutely everything was not fine. So let's drift softly toward the royal types who ended up needing Hecate's guidance, often without admitting it, because being a king in myth meant you were contractually obligated to pretend you had control. One of the earliest was King Eets of Colchis, the father of Medea. Eets is best known as the stressed-out man presiding over the famous Golden Fleece. But under the quiet glow of Hecate's torches, he becomes something far less epic and much more human. Eets was supposedly wise, but he had that particular kind of wisdom that evaporates the moment anyone asks a follow-up question. He ruled a land so far east it almost slipped into the edges of the mythical world. Misty valleys, moonlit hills, places where shadows did suspicious things. Hecate was deeply woven into Medea's childhood, teaching her the herbs that settled the spirit and the herbs that unsettled it just a little. Medea always insisted she learned everything about torches from Hecate, which is charming because it suggests the goddess was basically her night school instructor. Eets, meanwhile, was pacing endlessly through palace corridors, muttering about the fleece thieves he knew would eventually show up. When Jason and his Argonauts landed in Colchis like a group of enthusiastic tourists, Hecate's soft light became the backdrop to Medea's late-night decisions, those decisions that would shape her entire story. The myths say she used Hecate's torches to slip out into the night, wandering to the secret groves where she could think clearly without 20 palace servants hovering nearby. Jason needed guidance too, though he would never have admitted it. His confidence was mostly performative. When he finally agreed to work with Medea, he was guided not by strategy but by a deep confusion wrapped in charm. And as Medea led him through the moonlit fields, Hecate's torches flickered at the edges of the path, illuminating old altars and broken stones, remnants of older myths, older gods. But the quiet irony here is that Hecate guided both sides. She guided Medea toward her choices, and she guided Jason toward his destiny. She lit the roads, but she didn't pick the direction. Human choices, even for kings and heroes, still had to be made in the dim half-light. Let's drift gently to another king who wandered through her torchlight, King Perseus of Pylos. Not the monster slayer Perseus, the other one, the one who tends to get overshadowed because he never decapitated anything glamorous. Perseus was known more for his family than for heroic deeds. His palace was built near marshy fields where night mist curled up from the reeds. Travelers claimed they saw flickering lights there at night, lights they called Hecate's mirrors, reflections of her torches dancing on the water. Perseus had a habit of walking the marsh paths alone when he was anxious. It was the kind of kingly behavior that made his advisors nervous, but Perseus didn't care. He liked the silence, the way the world softened at night. And sometimes, only sometimes, the myths say he saw a glow in the distance. A pair of torches. Two small flames hovering steadily, waiting. Perseus was never harmed. He always returned calmer than when he left, as though the goddess walked beside him in silence. Those were the nights he made his best decisions. Not heroic decisions. Just small, practical, unexciting ones. Like how to settle minor disputes without starting a feud that lasted 3 generations. Hecate seemed to prefer kings who didn't turn everything into a catastrophe. But not all royals had that level of quiet self-awareness. Some needed far more help. Drifting across the mythic map, we find King Nisus of Megara, known mostly for the absurd purple lock of hair that determined the fate of his kingdom. He's exactly the kind of figure Hecate's torchlight suited. Slightly tragic, slightly ridiculous, very human. Nisus had a habit of patrolling the ramparts at night, staring out at the enemy campfires dotting the hills. He wasn't really afraid of the attackers. He was more afraid of the prophecy attached to his magical hair, that his life and the safety of the kingdom depended on one single tuft on the top of his head. Imagine the anxiety. On those long nights, Hecate's torches supposedly glimmered by the crossroads at the base of the hill, marking where the city's old road crossed into the countryside. Guards said they saw her, calmly illuminating the path, as if reminding Nisus that some fates couldn't be outpaced no matter how many laps he walked around the walls. The myths never suggest she intervened, not even when his daughter betrayed him, not even when the purple lock was cut. Hecate doesn't alter outcomes. She just casts enough light for people to see the edges of their own bad decisions. Let's drift onward, slowly, to King Minos of Crete, the man who thought he had everything under control, right up until the universe reminded him that arrogance is its own kind of labyrinth. Minos loved order. He loved rules. He built entire architectural nightmares just to prove he was smarter than everyone else. And he convinced himself he could outmaneuver the gods if he just planned carefully enough. Hecate, for her part, seemed to find him vaguely amusing. Travelers whispered that when Minos paced along the palace terraces at night, muttering about his complicated family issues, which included a monstrous stepson, a jealous wife, and questionable livestock arrangements, he occasionally glimpsed twin flames on the hill paths below Knossos. Her torches flickered in the distance, steady and patient, as if insisting that the night still belonged to older powers than royal ego. Hecate didn't frighten Minos. He was too stubborn to be scared. But the sightings made him uneasy, the way older myths always made newer kings uneasy. A reminder that beneath all his palace corridors, beneath every cleverly hidden door, there were deeper pathways he could never control. Another king, less famous but equally lost, was Enigmatic of Pisa. His entire legend revolves around his fear of a prophecy foretelling his death at the hands of his future son-in-law. Enigmatic responded to this prophecy with the time-honored royal strategy of make increasingly bad decisions until fate becomes inevitable. He challenged every suitor to a chariot race and executed those who lost, which was, frankly, all of them. He believed he was outwitting prophecy, but late at night, when the palace was quiet, he walked alone down to the old road that ran along the riverbank. There, a crossroads split the path. Local tradition said Hecate's torches could sometimes be seen hovering where the roads met. Steady flames, patient flames, flames that illuminated the places where fear twists into obsession. Enigmatic stared at the crossroads for hours. He never saw the goddess directly, though the torches seemed to move when he wasn't looking, as though reminding him, softly, almost kindly, that choices guided by fear rarely end well. Let's drift, almost weightlessly, toward another royal story touched by her light. The House of Cadmus, founders of Thebes, perhaps the most perennially unlucky family in all of mythology. Cadmus and Harmonia themselves were fine, calm, stable, surprisingly normal. But their descendants seemed allergic to peaceful life choices. Every generation produced someone who ignored advice, made a questionable decision, or believed Dionysus's party invitations were a good idea. One quiet tale says that Cadmus, long after founding the city, once followed a quiet glow outside the city gates. The fields were still, the air warm, and there, at the ancient triple crossroads, he saw Hecate's torches illuminating the stones. He knelt and placed a small offering, just bread and honey, not because he feared her, but because he understood the quiet weight of the old powers. It didn't fix his family's long-term issues, which would continue spiraling for generations, but in that moment he felt a rare sense of peace. Even founders need guidance sometimes. Hecate's torches touched the lives of queens too. Take Alcmene, mother of Heracles. She was not born into a peaceful family. She married into a kingdom constantly tangling with feuds, grudges, and dramatic relatives who treated oaths like suggestions. One myth says that on the night she fled from potential danger, carrying her young son, she wandered the dark roads outside Tiryns. That's when Hecate appeared, not dramatically, but softly, illuminating the path with her torches. Alcmene did not speak. She simply followed. The goddess walked ahead until Alcmene reached a safe grove where she could rest. Heracles grew up to have an overly complicated life, but for one brief night in infancy, Hecate ensured a quiet path. There's also the story of Queen Metanera of Eleusis, whose household became entangled with divine secrets when Demeter passed through in disguise. When the family's youngest child fell ill, Metanera is said to have prayed quietly at the crossroads outside her home. And though Demeter was nearby all along, the flicker of Hecate's torches appeared in the distance, a soft reminder that even mortal queens had a goddess watching gently at the boundaries. Let's wander a bit farther into the hazy corners of myth. There's a lesser-known king named Phineus, not the one tormented by harpies, but another Phineus, an older local ruler known mostly through scraps of tradition. He lived near coastal cliffs where nighttime came early, shadows stretching long over the paths. Fishermen whispered that when Phineus wandered too far along the cliffside road, Hecate's torches appeared beside him, guiding him home before the sea winds could knock him off balance. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't become a major myth. It was simply one of those small, comforting legends communities told themselves while navigating rocky landscapes in the dark. And then there's the lonely figure of King Athamas, who could have used guidance long before he stumbled into the chaos of his family's tragedies. Athamas married into problems. He remarried into new problems. And he ruled with the expression of a man eternally regretting his choices. Local myth says that on the nights when he wandered through the foggy fields outside Orchomenus, he sometimes saw a faint glow at the edge of the mist. 2 torches. Steady, patient, reminding him gently of the paths he should have taken. Athamas never followed. But the light was there anyway. Hecate's torches appear in these stories like soft punctuation marks, line breaks in the tangled paragraphs of royal lives. They show up when someone is lost, or frightened, or overthinking things at 2 in the morning. They burn quietly, steadily, illuminating not the grand destinies but the quiet steps along the way. And the kings weren't the only ones wandering. Royal children, especially those raised in sprawling palaces filled with echoing corridors, had their own nocturnal adventures. There is a tale about a young prince of Arcadia who sleepwalked through the palace nearly every night. His nurses were terrified he would fall down the stairs. But each time they followed him, they claimed he drifted toward the courtyard, where a faint light flickered by the gate, Hecate's torch, hovering like a nightlight for a child who had inherited far too much anxiety for his age. The prince eventually outgrew the sleepwalking, but the palace kept a small torch burning at the gate for years afterward. A tiny shrine, a quiet memory. Royal households often left offerings to her at crossroads just outside their walls, simple, quiet gestures. Bread, honey, small cups of wine. They didn't expect miracles. Just a bit of guidance. A soft glow on dark nights. A reminder that even kings and queens walk uncertain paths. The ancient world produced a constant flow of wanderers. Messengers, shepherds, merchants, exiles, fugitives, poets, philosophical drifters, and the kind of people who left home after an argument and refused to admit they were lost. These were the ones who relied most heavily on Hecate's torches. Not heroes, not kings, just ordinary mortals who wandered into the spaces where myth and night overlapped. The Greeks thought of darkness as a kind of boundary. During the day, the world belonged to humans. At night, it belonged to things slightly older, slightly stranger, and certainly less invested in human schedules. Roads looked different under moonlight. The air felt thicker, and every rustle in the brush was instantly assumed to be a spirit with strong opinions about travelers. Travelers were anxious but practical. They didn't expect a goddess to escort them personally, but they believed she might illuminate their path from a distance. A pair of torches glowing near the crossroads, or a flicker in the corner of their sight when they felt most unsure. The stories about these travelers are soft, quiet things. Not adventures, exactly. More like gentle reminders that survival often depended on small, steady light. One tale spoke of a shepherd from Thessaly named Daphnios, a man who had a habit of walking too long after sunset. He insisted he didn't mind the dark, but his sheep disagreed, scattering into inconvenient corners of the hills. On one foggy evening, Daphnios wandered so far that the path disappeared entirely, swallowed by mist. He stopped walking when he heard not wolves, but silence. A silence so complete it made him suddenly aware of his breathing. And then he saw it. 2 faint glows hovering between the trees. Not bright, not dramatic, just steady flames. They flickered without moving, as though resting patiently. Daphnios followed them, taking slow, careful steps. He didn't call out. He didn't ask questions. He just walked until the path beneath his feet reappeared. And when he finally looked back, the flames had vanished. When he returned home, he mentioned the torches to his grandmother, who simply nodded and said, "Well, she must have been bored tonight." The Greeks didn't treat these encounters as shocking. They were just part of how the world worked. Sometimes the goddess at the crossroads walked with you. Another story came from Crete, about a fisherman named Lysanios, who ventured inland after bringing his nets ashore. Fishermen had a particular sensitivity to nighttime, because tides and moonlight shaped their schedules. Lysanios often walked the path between the shore and his little house perched near a cliff. But one night, he misjudged the fading daylight and set out home after the moon had already risen high. Halfway along the road, the sea wind blew hard enough to confuse the landscape before him. The cliffs blurred. The safe turnoff vanished. And the waves, crashing below in the darkness, sounded much closer than usual. That was when he noticed a glow behind him, not from the sea, not from the sky, but from the inland path he had accidentally wandered past. 2 torches. Steady, quiet. He walked toward them, and they retreated slowly, leading him back to the path he knew. The cliffs would have taken him if he'd continued forward, but he didn't realize that until the next morning, when he saw how close he'd been to the edge. That night, Lysanios left a basket of olives at the crossroads, a simple thanks for guidance he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Some travelers met her indirectly. A merchant from Boeotia named Chirinos once walked the long road between villages carrying a sack of grain that was heavier than his ambitions warranted. He kept muttering that he should have hired a donkey, which was true, but donkeys cost money, and Chirinos liked to pretend he was saving it. The path curved along a dense grove, where the branches met overhead and turned the twilight into darkness. Chirinos felt the familiar anxiety of realizing he'd traveled too late, and then, predictably, he tripped on a stone and dropped half the grain. As he knelt to scoop it up, he noticed a glow far down the road, faint but unmistakable. 2 small torches. No movement. No wind. Chirinos decided this was a sign to stop rushing. He picked up what grain he could, tightened the straps on the sack, and walked toward the light. By the time he reached the spot, the flames were gone, but the trees had thinned enough for him to see the moon clearly. He never saw the goddess, but the steady glow had guided him through the worst part of the grove. He later told the story to his wife, who nodded and said, "Maybe next time you'll hire the donkey." The Greeks often cared more about the lesson than the miracle. Another traveler, a wanderer named Iona from the mountainous regions near Arcadia, didn't expect divine help at all. She preferred solitude. She walked long distances alone, following winding goat paths and narrow tracks that connected remote villages. She carried herbs and salves, offering healing to those who lived far from the towns. People said she learned her craft from nymphs, but Iona always claimed her knowledge came from observing plants herself. Her travels often pushed her into twilight, especially in the late seasons when daylight faded too quickly. Iona understood the risks but accepted them. And on one cold evening, when mist rose from the rocky slopes, she took a wrong turn. It wasn't a dramatic wrong turn, just enough to nudge her toward a ravine rather than a climbable path. A faint glow appeared, not ahead but to her right. 2 torches, low to the ground as if waiting. Iona paused, then stepped toward them. The ground beneath her feet felt level again. The path curved upward. When she looked back, the flames had already dissolved into darkness. Iona never thanked the goddess with words. She left an offering of crushed thyme at the nearest crossroads instead, murmuring a soft acknowledgement only she could hear. Travelers weren't always adults. Children sometimes wandered, curious, impulsive, and largely unaware of the nighttime dangers. One such story revolves around a boy from Attica who followed a stray dog too far into the countryside. The evening grew colder, the hills darkened, and the dog, who had absolutely no sense of responsibility, disappeared entirely. The boy sat on a stone and started crying quietly, not loudly enough to be heard but just enough to feel overwhelmed. That was when he saw the glow, gentle, warm, and low to the ground. 2 torches flickered as though held by someone his height. The flames bobbed slightly, like a playful gesture. The boy stood, wiped his face, and followed. He walked until he recognized the old fig tree near his village. When he turned around, no one was there. The boy told his mother he'd seen the Fire Lady, which she interpreted with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She placed a small honey cake at the crossroads that evening, a traditional offering, simple and sweet. Some travelers weren't lost geographically, they were lost emotionally. A young poet from Lesbos once wandered the shoreline after a particularly uninspiring day. He had spent 12 hours trying to write a single decent line of poetry and failed. He insisted he didn't need divine inspiration, which was the surest way to guarantee he wouldn't receive any. As the night settled, he walked the same path repeatedly, muttering unfinished verse fragments. Eventually, he slumped beside an old boundary stone. His mind was tired, his heart even more so, and he wasn't paying attention to the landscape around him. A faint glow appeared near the shoreline. 2 torches, not guiding him anywhere specific, just reminding him that darkness didn't have to be absolute. The poet watched the flames flicker, steady and patient, until the tension drained from his shoulders. The next morning, he wrote one of his gentlest poems, a soft piece about torchlight reflected on water. He never claimed divine influence, but the imagery lingered in everything he wrote afterward. There's also the story of a group of travelers from Phocis who took a pilgrimage to a small, ancient shrine in the hills. They underestimated the length of the journey, a classic traveler mistake, and found themselves descending steep slopes in the dark. Their lantern flickered out. The path forked, and no one could remember whether the shrine lay to the left or the right. That was when they noticed twin flames glowing on the right-hand path. They followed without speaking. The torches guided them through twists and turns until the shrine appeared on the ridge ahead, lit by moonlight. The travelers knelt and left offerings. No one doubted whose flames had led them. They didn't see her, but they felt the calm assurance of her presence. Some stories involved more ambiguous figures, those who weren't strictly mortals or immortals. There's a tale of a wandering hunter named Kelios, who roamed the forests wearing antlers during rituals. His identity blurred between man and myth. One night, while tracking the movement of the moon, he noticed a glow by the hillside. 2 torches stood at the entrance of a narrow passage he had never seen before. He followed them into a small glen where medicinal herbs grew, plants rarely found outside secret groves. When he tried to return the next morning, the path no longer existed. Only the memory of the torchlight remained, marking the night as something liminal, where boundaries softened just enough for guidance to slip through. In other stories, the torches acted less like signs and more like warnings. Another traveler from Argolis, a woman named Clearita, was known for her stubborn independence. She insisted she could navigate any road, any terrain. And she could, during daylight. But on one windy evening, she stubbornly pushed forward through a rocky gorge where darkness fell too quickly. Ahead, she saw a pair of torches flicker in the wind. They weren't guiding her forward, they were blocking the path. Standing still, unmoving. When she tried approaching, the flames dimmed. When she stepped back, they brightened again. Clarita realized she was being turned around, gently but firmly. She followed the light backward until she reached a safe plateau. The next morning, she saw that the gorge ahead had been swept by falling rocks overnight. Hecate's torches didn't always show where to go. Sometimes they told you where not to. Some travelers encountered her presence not through light but through sound. Dogs, sacred to Hecate, often signaled her approach with eerie but strangely comforting howls. A wanderer near Ephesus once described following the sound of distant dogs at midnight, each howl echoing like a thread leading him home. When he reached the crossroads, the torches appeared briefly, just long enough to show him the correct path, before fading behind him. He couldn't remember their shape, only their warmth. A group of young philosophers from Athens once debated whether the torch myths were literal or symbolic. They traveled to a rural festival to interview locals about Hecate. During their walk home after the festivities, they argued about metaphor versus reality. The final word came when a faint torch glow flickered ahead of them, illuminating the path. The philosophers stopped talking immediately. They followed the light in respectful silence, abandoning the debate altogether. After that night, none of them felt the need to define the experience. Some truths didn't require categorization. Even exiles found her light. A man banished from his home island wandered the coastal roads of mainland Greece with nothing but a cloak and a small bag of dried figs. One foggy night, he lost the road entirely. He sat in the grass, certain he had made a mistake returning to the coast. Then, gentle as breath, two torches glowed in the mist. He followed them to an abandoned hut where he could rest. When he woke, the fog had lifted and the path was clear. He never returned to his old home, but he credited the goddess with giving him the courage to build a new life. Night travel remained dangerous, but these stories softened the edges. The presence of Hecate's torches didn't transform travelers into heroes. They didn't elevate their journeys into epics. They just helped them get home, or keep moving, or avoid cliffs, wolves, and emotional spirals. The light was steady, the guidance quiet, the intervention subtle. As the myths spread across the ancient world, travelers began leaving small offerings at crossroads. Not elaborate shrines, just crumbs of bread, sprigs of rosemary, shells, bits of wool. Quiet tokens of gratitude for a goddess who asked for so little and gave just enough. Let's drift back into the quiet edges of the ancient world. This time, we settle near the shorelines where Greek heroes tended to wander far from home, usually for reasons that made very little sense. The sort of men who would hear a divine whisper, interpret it completely incorrectly, and then march off into the wilderness with the confidence of someone who had never once read an instruction tablet in their life. And as they wandered, predictably getting lost, overheated, underfed, or spiritually confused, Hecate's torches showed up again and again, like a divine version of those late-night road service vans that rescue people who locked their keys in the chariot. Her role here is soft, quiet, almost maternal, in a "fine, I'll help you, but I'm not going to pretend you didn't cause this mess yourself" sort of way. The kind of cosmic babysitter ancient travelers desperately needed. Let's float into it gently. Hecate had this steady presence in stories where heroes drifted off course. She never barged in with trumpets or lightning or glamorous celestial drama. Instead, she appeared like a warm glow in the distance. Two slim torches. A figure in the misty dark. Someone who simply existed at the boundary between "I have no idea where I am" and "fine, I'll move in that direction and hope." For many wanderers, she was the last friendly light before danger. Take Orpheus, wandering out of the underworld after doing the absolute least effective negotiation in myth. Before he descended, he had been brave, poetic, tragic. After climbing back toward daylight, he was mostly a man panicking about whether his wife was still walking behind him. Hecate's torches were said to flicker faintly in some versions, steady, unchanging, like a reminder to keep moving and not overthink. Unfortunately, Orpheus's specialty was overthinking. He glanced back anyway, confirming he had learned absolutely nothing from the entire experience. But the presence of Hecate's light in the background reminds us that even in myths full of personal errors, she lingers at the edge, offering a calm, stable direction. She wasn't there to intervene in every poor decision. She was just there to illuminate. Now, heroes, proper heroes, tended to treat darkness like it was something they could outmuscle. But walking through a forest at night without a torch is exactly the kind of idea someone like Theseus would call a bold and innovative strategy, right before falling into a ditch. Hecate's light prevented that sort of thing. In many local traditions, travelers would carry small offerings, herbs, garlic, honey, to leave at wayside shrines so her guiding presence wouldn't abandon them. The message was simple: please help me not walk off a cliff tonight. Here is a snack as incentive. It was a better system than most ancient safety practices. The Greeks knew something important. Nighttime was not the domain of heroes. It was the domain of things unseen. Wandering spirits, fading boundaries, echoing sounds that didn't match their sources. This was Hecate's territory, and she didn't take it lightly. In the hours when others hid indoors, she walked calmly through the liminal spaces, those edges between wilderness and road, sea and land, sleep and waking. Travelers respected that. They didn't imagine her swooping down like Athena or shouting like Ares. Instead, they pictured a tall figure with steady hands and twin flames held up just high enough to mark the safe path. Her light didn't reveal everything, only what mattered. A bend in the road, a patch of ground without holes, a turning that wouldn't lead straight into a swamp. Her torches offered quiet reassurance. Not clarity, just enough visibility to keep a mortal from ruining their life before dawn. Let's drift over to Jason for a moment. Another man who routinely outsourced his survival to divine women. Jason had one skill: being vaguely pleasant-looking and exceptionally confident despite having accomplished nothing on his own. His life was essentially one long group project. But as the Argonauts traveled through unfamiliar lands, there were old regional tales whispering that a soft torchlight sometimes appeared along the coastline at night, guiding their ship away from rocks. It was never dramatic. It wasn't Zeus hurling storms or Poseidon shaking the waves. It was more like a quiet assurance, a line of gentle flame marking the safe route forward. Not all myths spell it out, but many suggest her influence in the background, subtle and steady, Hecate's preferred style. Another hero who benefited from her presence, though he rarely noticed, was Heracles. Not the smartest, strong, determined, sure, but navigating after dark? He would follow any sound that vaguely resembled a challenge. If a goat sneezed in the distance, he would absolutely charge toward it under the assumption that destiny awaited. Somewhere in the quiet of old regional folklore, Hecate's torches burned specifically for men like him. Large, heroic, and painfully directionless. Her flames steadied travelers who struggled with the basics. Left foot, right foot. Follow the glow. Try not to fight a bush thinking it's a monster. Now, the Greeks didn't imagine the countryside lit with constant divine fireworks. Most of the time, the world was dim, uneventful, a soft gray. Nighttime travel was slow and cautious, full of gentle sounds, owls shifting, wind in olive trees, the distant splash of water. Into that muted world, Hecate fit perfectly. Her torches didn't blaze, they glimmered. They pulsed lightly, like fireflies caught in a slow dance. Her presence was meant to calm, not alarm. You could almost imagine the scene. A lone traveler, breathing carefully, clutching a worn cloak around their shoulders, staring ahead at two faint golden points hovering near a crossroads. They wouldn't run toward them. They'd simply follow with steady steps, trusting the quiet figure who waited there. And she would guide them not just with the torches, but with the stillness around her. Where Hecate stood, the world seemed less uncertain. Not safer, just clearer. It's important to remember that she wasn't simply a goddess of fearsome boundaries. She was also a goddess of transitions. Physical and emotional. The transitions between places. Between states of mind, between confusion and direction. Her torches symbolized movement, but gentle movement, the sort you make when you're tired and you don't want to think too hard about which path to take. Let's float over to another example, the wanderers returning from Eleusinian rites. These were ordinary people, not heroes. They had walked miles into sacred darkness for the ceremonies. When they returned home, they often mentioned lights along the road, symbolic or divine, guiding them through the night. Hecate's presence here was believed by some to be woven into the ritual landscape. A reassuring friend of Demeter, a silent guardian at the margins. She wasn't there to shock or impress. She was there the way a nightlight is there, quietly preventing chaos. And unlike many Greek deities, she didn't demand constant attention. She wasn't fragile about respect. She didn't need weekly temples or loud sacrifices. Simple offerings left at crossroads were enough. A bit of food, a brief whispered hope for safe passage. Her power was quiet, practical, grounded. That's part of why ancient households placed her images near doorways or gates. Not to summon thunder or miracles, but to keep things steady, to keep the night manageable, to keep wandering spirits uninterested. And for travelers, she was an even more comforting presence. Someone who already understood darkness. Someone who didn't fear it or fight it. Someone who walked in it as easily as mortals walked under the sun. You can almost see her torchlight spreading across uneven stones or dirt paths. A slow warmth, a mild glow. The kind of illumination that helps your eyes relax instead of straining to catch details. She wasn't guiding travelers toward triumph, just toward the next safe step. That was enough. As more heroes and wanderers entered the mythic tradition, Hecate's torches remained the consistent symbol of nighttime safety. Whether someone was running from a prophecy, wandering after an argument with a relative, or simply too proud to admit they'd taken the wrong road hours ago, she was there. Two gentle flames. A still figure. A reminder that not all guidance needs to be loud or profound. Sometimes it just needs to be visible. And in the soft rhythm of mythology, where people constantly lose their way, literally or emotionally, the presence of a calm, steady light has its own quiet power. Night in the ancient world had a texture, soft, uneven, and full of space for the imagination to wander. People didn't fill it with noise or endless lanterns. They let the dark breathe. They respected it. And somewhere in that wide, velvet quiet, Hecate moved with her slow-burning torches, illuminating the private rituals mortals performed when the rest of the world slept. These weren't grand ceremonies. No stadium crowds. No trumpets or priests shouting invocations over one another. Just small, personal, slightly awkward nocturnal habits that ordinary Greeks maintained because they felt safer that way. A kind of ancient spiritual housekeeping routine. And, predictably, Hecate was the figure who watched over it all, quietly, patiently, like the friend who doesn't talk much but always turns on the porch light for you. Her worship was often intimate, low-key, domestic in a way that other goddesses, especially the glamorous ones, would never tolerate. Hecate didn't mind being associated with humble spaces. Doorways, crossroads, thresholds. The spots where people paused, not because they wanted to, but because transitions felt uncomfortable. And that discomfort had rituals of its own. One of the most common offerings placed at these liminal spots was the Hecate's Deepnon, a tiny monthly ritual that happened during the darkest part of the lunar cycle. It was the kind of tradition that modern people would absolutely forget about until the last minute, but the ancients treated it seriously. They prepared quiet meals, simple foods like garlic, eggs, fish, or small cakes, then took them to a crossroads after sunset. The idea wasn't to impress her, just to acknowledge the transition from one lunar phase to the next, and to leave anything unclean or unlucky behind. The food wasn't meant to be reclaimed. It belonged to Hecate, and to anyone else walking in the night who needed a meal. This part was quietly understood. The goddess got the gesture, and the hungry got the nourishment. No one said it out loud, but everyone let the practice stand because it worked for everyone involved. And there, hovering near the shadowy edge of the road, her soft torchlight was imagined to flicker, watching the offering with the same expression someone has as they check their mailbox at 2 a.m. Not threatening, just present, politely supervising the weirdness of human tradition. Let's float gently into another ritual, one involving purification. Not dramatic religious purifications, just small cleansings people performed when something felt off in the house. If someone had a bad dream, or a relative left after an argument, or the domestic mood felt a little too heavy, people burned small herbs at night near doorways. A kind of ancient aromatherapy. But instead of lavender mist diffusers, they burned dried plants like saffron, myrrh, or mint. The scent drifting into the night was believed to catch Hecate's attention. Nothing drastic happened in response. She didn't materialize or rearrange the furniture. But the idea that her torchlight passed by, briefly illuminating the doorway and carrying away unwanted energy, was enough to help people sleep more peacefully. Her rituals weren't about spectacle. They were about steadiness. A reset button before sunrise. Even more interesting were the domestic shrines, small household altars dedicated to her. They weren't elaborate. Just stone slabs or clay statues placed near entrances. Even wealthy families didn't overdo it. Hecate didn't enjoy over-the-top offerings. She liked practicality, quiet devotion, the kind of worship that didn't inconvenience anyone too much. Families placed these shrines where the flicker of a household lamp could reach them. The gentle flame made her presence feel natural, like she was part of the home's nightly rhythm rather than a dramatic visitor. Children grew up seeing her image beside their door, not frightening but familiar. A nighttime companion. An anchor for their sense of safety. Let's drift to the countryside for a moment. In rural areas, small altars to Hecate stood at the edges of farms. Farmers believed her torchlight helped keep predators away at night, not through direct divine intervention, but by creating a symbolic sense of illumination and vigilance. Wolves and spirits alike, they hoped, would avoid illuminated spaces, even metaphorical ones. It's a gentle sort of superstition. Hopeful, practical, and again very Hecate. Her rituals also appeared when people traveled between towns. Travelers sometimes carried miniature torches, small bundles of sticks or reeds bound together, that they would light only at the darkest part of their journey. Not as a signal to the goddess, exactly, but as a way to echo her. A soft imitation, a request for company on the road. Lighting those small torches was a steadying act. It gave a traveler something to focus on besides the silence of the night or the distant rustle of animals. People whispered prayers into the flame, nothing grand, more along the lines of, "Please make sure I don't trip on a root and embarrass myself in front of absolutely no one." The flame became a moving extension of Hecate's own light. So, guiding. Another ritual emerged after emotional transitions, breakups, losses, or changes in fortune. People would bring small symbolic items to the roadside at night, leaving them behind to mark the end of a personal chapter. These objects weren't valuable. Maybe a broken household tool. Maybe a scrap of old clothing. Maybe a wilted wreath from a festival long forgotten. They didn't want the objects anymore. But they didn't want to throw them away, either. So they gave them to the crossroads, Hecate's domain. She wasn't judging the items or the reasons behind them. She simply accepted them as part of the natural messiness of mortal lives. Her torches lit the places where those symbolic burdens were left behind, giving people a sense that their emotional clutter was now someone else's quiet responsibility. Not erased, just transformed into night's business rather than theirs. Some rituals focused on sleep itself. People would whisper her name before bed when the house felt uneasy. They didn't expect visions or dreams. They simply wanted a calm night, a torch-lit mental path through whatever thoughts might wander toward them. Hecate's reputation wasn't one of chaos. It was one of clarity in darkness. She embodied the idea that nighttime didn't need to be frightening, just navigated gently. In some rare traditions, families kept tiny clay dogs in their homes, believing Hecate's own spectral hounds watched over them at night. The dogs weren't fierce. They were more like loyal shadows, quiet companions to the torchlight she carried. Children, half asleep, sometimes whispered to these little figurines as if talking to a pet. And in the soft torchlit imagination of nighttime, they believed the dogs answered with silent protection. Her rituals, in all their forms, encouraged slowness. Breathing. A sense of grounding in the dark. She didn't ask her followers to conquer anything, just to move gently through the shadows, trusting her light to guide them from one quiet moment to the next. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over the world when someone walks alone at night. A silence that isn't frightening, exactly, just honest. It leaves room for the mind to wander into places it usually avoids in daylight. Ancient Greeks understood this feeling well. They believed nighttime wasn't just for physical travel. It was for emotional wandering too. And unsurprisingly, Hecate, goddess of thresholds, transitions, and everything humans weren't quite ready to name, became the quiet companion for people drifting through the softer, sadder edges of life. Her torches didn't just guide lost feet. They guided tired hearts. Those hearts that carried just a bit too much. People didn't go to Apollo for this. He was too bright, too confident, too, look at me, I have perfect cheekbones. They didn't go to Zeus, who would absolutely ignore them unless lightning was somehow involved. And they didn't go to Hera, who was usually preoccupied with Zeus-related disasters. They went, quietly, into Hecate's night. That's where the lonely wanderers walked. The ones who slipped out of their homes late in the evening, not because they had urgent business, but because they needed air, needed space, needed the hush of a world half asleep to sort themselves out. Some left after arguments, some after losses, some simply because the weight of their own thoughts felt too heavy to sit with indoors. These wanderers didn't seek immortals to fix their lives. They just hoped for a sign that the path forward wasn't as tangled as it felt. And in the softest corners of Greek tradition, there were quiet stories of Hecate's torches flickering near the crossroads in moments like these, not as grand interventions, but as calm reminders. You can keep walking. You're not alone. Let's float toward one of these stories, not one with heroics or monsters, just an ordinary person trying to navigate an emotional night. There was a small tale from the Aegean Islands about a widow who walked to the edge of her village each month. She had lost her husband early, and while she had family, she still felt a certain kind of solitude, the kind that isn't solved by conversation. So she left a little offering at a crossroads, a small bowl of honey water and a sprig of herbs. It wasn't a ritual with strict rules. It was more like a soft habit, an emotional exhale. Villagers said they sometimes saw a faint glow at the crossroads when she returned home. Two small flames, steady and warm. They claimed it was Hecate's torches watching her return. Not guiding, just acknowledging. Another story tells of a young man who wandered at night after failing miserably at a trade he wasn't suited for. He thought the gods were punishing him. Bad harvest, bad luck, bad everything. But an older neighbor told him to walk the road at night, leave a clay fragment at the crossroads, and let Hecate sort it out. Not solve it, just sort it emotionally. So he did. And the quiet walk helped him more than any divine thunderbolt ever could. The torchlight he imagined at the crossroads soothed him into understanding something simple. Maybe he wasn't cursed. Maybe he just wasn't a good potter. These things happen. Hecate never needed worshippers to be extraordinary, just honest about where they stood. She wasn't a goddess of triumph. She was a goddess of late-night clarity. Let's drift gently into a more mythic example, Medea. The dramatic one, the one whose entire life was essentially a collection of red flags. Medea was deeply associated with Hecate, not because she was wicked, though the later poets definitely leaned into that, but because Medea belonged to the emotional twilight of Greek storytelling. She lived in the cracks of myth, between loyalty and betrayal, identity and exile, love and power. Hecate's torches appear faintly in her story, glowing behind her choices. Not validating them, just illuminating the crossroads she stood at. When Medea left her homeland, heart cracking under the weight of leaving her family and everything familiar, some versions say Hecate's light guided her ship. Not dramatically, just a glow that kept the sea from feeling endless. It's the kind of detail that makes myth feel human. Even those with magic felt lost sometimes. Another emotionally tangled figure touched by Hecate's presence was Persephone. Their bond wasn't forged through chaos, but through sympathy. Persephone lived in cycles, half above ground, half below, constantly crossing thresholds. Hecate understood that rhythm better than anyone. When Persephone returned to the surface each spring, Hecate walked with her holding torches. Not because the underworld was scary, but because transitions, big or small, feel easier when someone walks beside you. Even gods appreciated soft company. That image of the two figures moving through the dim, early spring twilight became one of the gentlest scenes in Greek myth. No drama, no conflict, just two beings walking quietly between worlds, with firelight touching the edges of the path. And that's how ordinary Greeks imagined their own emotional shifts. Not as battles, not as tragedies, just as slow walks through dark places, accompanied by a goddess who understood confusion. Let's drift back to mortals for a moment. Some wandered after heartbreak, not the dramatic epic kind, just the dull, embarrassing, everyday heartbreaks humans excel at. A relationship that didn't work, a hopeful moment that fizzled, a silly misunderstanding that somehow turned into a month of awkward silence. People lit small lamps to mirror Hecate's torches. They placed them on windowsills or doorsteps, not to summon the goddess, but to remind themselves that even emotional darkness has a pathway through it. In one old Thessalian fragment, a girl leaves a pair of tiny candles at her doorway after an argument with her family. The text says she prayed not for reconciliation, but for a calmer heart, a wish for internal gentleness. And Hecate, unsurprisingly, was the goddess invoked for that. Not because she fixed emotions, but because she helped people find their way through them. Her guiding style wasn't about wisdom or prophecy. She didn't deliver advice. She didn't drop omens. She didn't give visions. She simply illuminated the next step so mortals didn't have to solve everything at once. That's why emotional wanderers, people mid-transition, felt drawn to her. Plus, confusion, uncertainty, restlessness. These were her domain as much as crossroads and doorways. When someone paced the streets at night with too many thoughts in their head, the imagined glow of her torches became a soft comfort. A way of saying, "It's all right, keep walking. The night has room for you." And that's the heart of Hecate's emotional mythology. Nothing explosive, nothing triumphant, nothing sharp. Just the gentle assurance that darkness wasn't an enemy, and wandering wasn't a failure. Her torches created a path for the lonely, the heart-heavy, the unsure. A path made not of answers, but of quiet visibility. A single step at a time. Now, by the time we reach ancient grain storage, most people's eyes have already glazed over, which, frankly, is perfect. Because this is the exact point in history where even the historians start clocking out mentally, and the scribes of the ancient world start inventing whole new categories of paperwork simply because someone looked at a pile of grain the wrong way. Grain. Little crunchy seeds. The building blocks of bread, beer, porridges, and several thousand extremely tedious administrative records. Let's set the scene. Imagine a dusty granary somewhere in the late Bronze Age. The walls are thick mud brick, the air smells faintly of barley husks, and a man with a reed stylus and an expression of catastrophic boredom is hunched over a clay tablet thinking, "If the gods loved me, they would have made me a potter instead." Because grain was wealth, like gold, but edible and with far more opportunities for rodents to ruin your day. And that meant someone had to track every handful. Someone had to count it, weigh it, tally it, ret-ally it, compare it, summarize it, seal it, unseal it, reseal it, and then file it on a shelf where it would sit next to 400 nearly identical tablets, all of which would one day be excavated by cheerful archaeologists who would say things like, "Oh, wonderful. Another storage inventory," while their grad students slowly lost the will to live. Now, the funniest part, and by funniest, I mean deeply bureaucratic in a soul-numbing way, is that ancient grain tracking systems were often needlessly complicated. Not because they had to be, but because early states seemed to believe that if you didn't need 2 or 3 redundant systems, you just weren't doing paperwork correctly. For example, in Mesopotamia, they loved a good multi-step process. You couldn't simply say, "We received 20 baskets of barley." You needed a tablet recording the delivery, a tablet confirming that tablet, a counter tablet verifying the confirmation tablet, a sealing tablet declaring that everything had been done properly, and finally, a storage tablet indicating where in the building the grain was actually placed. At that point, honestly, the grain itself felt like a supporting character in its own story. Then there were receipts. Yes, receipts. Thousands of years before your modern grocery store printed out a 3-foot-long strip of thermal paper to tell you saved 12 cents on lentils, ancient administrators were already perfecting the art of producing documentation that was significantly longer than the transaction it documented. And if you think this only happened in one region, oh no. Humanity apparently just has a universal instinct toward bureaucracy, like a migratory pattern, but for redundant forms. Egypt had scribes who could record grain yields with a level of precision that makes modern accountants look reckless. China had granary officials who kept inventories so detailed that you could probably reconstruct the weather of entire provinces just from spoilage notes. And medieval Europe added its own twist, grain tallies carved onto split wooden sticks called tally marks, which were then used as legal proof of debts. And here's the real kicker, all of this mattered immensely. Because if the granary numbers didn't match what came out of the fields, well, somebody was definitely getting yelled at, or fined, or publicly shamed. Possibly all three. And in rare cases, when things were truly dire, entire investigations unfolded over missing sacks of barley as if they were major state crimes. Meanwhile, somewhere in the corner, a mouse was eating the evidence. We also shouldn't underestimate the role grain storage played in building early governments. Without reliable stores, you didn't have stable armies, or trade networks, or giant, impressive temples made of stone. What you had was a society that starved every time the weather threw a tantrum. So, yes, painfully boring though it may sound, grain storage was one of the gears holding early civilizations together. And like most gears, it turned slowly, quietly, and with a great deal of dust. But that's exactly what makes this chapter so soothing to fall asleep to. Nothing chaotic happens. Nobody conquers anything. The world simply continues its slow, grain-counting march forward. And now that your brain has fully wandered into the soft beige fog of ancient bureaucracy, we can gently drift toward the next chapter, which is somehow even slower. Because of course it is. If you've ever looked at a giant stone disk and thought, ah yes, that looks like an object that has witnessed centuries of uneventful workplace drama, congratulations, you have just described the medieval millstone. Today's chapter is dedicated to these heavy, round, unbelievably patient workers of the pre-industrial world. Millstones did not rush. Millstones did not stress. Millstones did not aspire to promotions, because frankly, what role is higher than the big rock everyone depends on? No, really. Millstones were celebrity objects in their communities. They ground grain, which meant they made flour, which meant they made bread, which meant they essentially powered the medieval diet. If a millstone cracked, the entire village entered what we might theatrically describe as a mild inconvenience. There are records of towns treating a broken millstone like a mini-state emergency. Now, the most soothing aspect of medieval milling is how deeply repetitive it was. You had two stones, the bedstone, the introverted one that never moved, and the runner stone, the slightly more energetic one that rotated. Together, they crushed grains into flour with the slow, consistent rhythm of a snoring giant. Medieval people listened to mills the way modern people listen to white noise machines. A steady grinding sound meant everything was functioning, the grain was flowing, and nobody had to panic about rye shortages or accidental famine. Millstones were also incredibly picky. They needed to be made of exactly the right kind of rock, hard enough to grind grain, but not so hard that they turned the flour into quartz confetti. And if you really wanted to go premium, you bought French burstone imported all the way from the quarries near Paris. Imagine traveling days by ox cart just to purchase a large rock disc because it produced flour so fluffy people described it as exceptionally honest. Yes, that's a real medieval compliment. Flour could apparently be honest or dishonest, which makes you wonder how much lying was happening in the average sack of grain. But millstones weren't just tools, they were minor bureaucratic celebrities, which seems to be a recurring theme in agricultural history. Every milling session required records: how much grain came in, how much flour went out, who brought what, whether the miller took a fair cut of the profit, and whether anyone was caught trying to, accidentally, pour an extra handful of wheat into their own bag while the miller wasn't looking. And let's be honest, the miller was always suspicious. Medieval millers have an almost comical reputation in folklore as men who were constantly cheating, or maybe just being accused of cheating because nobody wanted to pay the milling fee. If a villager thought their flour yield was a bit low, the miller immediately became the prime suspect. Never mind that sometimes the rye was just mediocre, or the wind wasn't strong, or the grain had been stored next to a suspiciously ambitious family of mice. Speaking of wind, windmills were a surprisingly late arrival in Europe. Before that, everything depended on watermills, which meant entire villages organized their lives around rivers and streams. If the water was too low, the millstones didn't turn. If the water was too high, the mill flooded. And if the water froze, well, everyone took a deep breath, rationed their flour, and prayed for an early spring. It was a slow life, a predictable life, and a flour-dusted life. Millstones simply turned hour after hour, day after day, turning chaos into carbohydrates with the patient serenity of objects that had no intention of doing anything else. And the thing is, it worked. Millstones quietly sustained medieval diets for centuries, without drama, without interruptions, and without ever needing a performance review. Let's drift over to something even older, slower, and more committed to doing absolutely nothing for centuries: the olive tree. If you've ever wanted a historical figure who basically said, "No thanks, I'll just stand here for 800 years, the olive tree is your protagonist." Ancient people loved olives, not just for eating or oil, but for their vibe. Olive trees mastered the art of lazy longevity. They grew slowly, like they were savoring every moment, and produced fruit with the same energy someone might use to answer emails at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. Just enough effort to not get fired by nature. In Greece, olive trees were the plants everyone bragged about. They were tied to Athena, of course, because nothing says wisdom like a tree that refuses to die even when slightly neglected. When Athenians told the story of how Athena won the city by offering the first olive tree, they conveniently skipped the part where olives take forever to ripen. But they didn't mind. Waiting was basically the national pastime. The biggest olive groves were treated like extended families. Farmers visited them, murmured to them, inspected them, and generally behaved like social workers checking on elderly relatives. And olive trees responded by being dignified, slightly grouchy elders. They didn't grow tall. They didn't grow fast. They just thickened and twisted their trunks like they were collecting emotional baggage. Every century added a new curve or knot, like a diary entry written in bark. Year 300, the weather was acceptable. Year 450, goats got too close, again. Year 510, someone pruned me incorrectly, I will remember this until the sun dies. Olives also had a reputation for being a little dramatic when it came to climate. Too much rain? They sulked. Too little rain? They sulked harder. Strong winds? They clung to branches like divas refusing to be blown off stage. And yet, through all that, they endured. In ancient Greek households, olive oil was everything. Cooking oil, lamp fuel, moisturizer, perfume base, cleaning agent, and in at least one recorded case, a method for making wrestlers extremely slippery and hard to grab, because nothing says athletic dignity like two men trying to hold onto each other while drenched in artisanal salad dressing. Olive presses were another universe of slow, steady work. The process involved crushing the olives into a paste, then squeezing the paste until the oil seeped out in a thick, dreamy stream. It was very meditative, assuming you ignored the creaking beams, the muscled workers, and the occasional donkey who absolutely would not walk in a straight circle no matter how politely asked. The funny thing about olive trees is that they were seen as symbols of peace, even though harvesting olives required climbing ladders, hitting branches with sticks, spreading nets, collecting runaway fruits, and occasionally shouting at cousins who dropped everything. Peaceful in theory, mildly chaotic in practice. But the trees themselves didn't care. They stood there, unfazed, ancient souls watching generation after generation of humans live fast, die faster, and complain about taxes in every era. Olive trees simply continued their slow, quiet, sappy existence. Their stillness made them ideal background characters in mythology. Olive trees rarely starred in dramatic plotlines. No hero ever said, I must seek the enchanted olive tree of destiny. Olive trees were more like, I'm here. I exist. That's enough. And honestly, that's kind of soothing. Let's settle into the quiet world of people who spent their entire lives writing, very slowly, on materials that absolutely did not cooperate. Because if anyone embodied the concept of patient suffering wrapped in ink stains, it was the ancient scribe. Scribes were the unsung background characters of civilization. They weren't warriors or kings or glamorous poets wandering around claiming divine inspiration. They were the practical ones, the steady ones, the ones hunched over desks thinking, yes, I will write your 10th tax record today, even though you clearly haven't moved since the last census. In Egypt, scribes gained a reputation as elite scholars, mostly because they were among the few people who could read. Everyone else was just vibing, trusting that whatever the scribe wrote down about their grain quota was probably correct and not creatively adjusted for convenience. Egyptians called writing a divine art. Scribes called it another day dipping a reed into ink and praying the papyrus doesn't tear again. Papyrus, by the way, had a personality. If it was too dry, it cracked like a grumpy old man refusing to stretch. If it was too damp, it wrinkled into a texture best described as ancient laundry accident. Scribes had to smooth, flatten, trim, and occasionally glare at it until it behaved. Most of their work wasn't glamorous. You can forget the dramatic scenes of scribes dutifully recording prophecies or immortalizing pharaohs. The real majority of scribe life was just lists. Endless lists. Lists of workers. Lists of donkeys. Lists of grain shipments. Lists confirming that the same guy named Hori borrowed the same 2 baskets every week and never returned them. Their days were governed by repetition. Dip the reed. Write the stroke. Exhale slowly. Dip again. Consider taking a nap maybe forever. And yet scribes were respected, partly because they performed work nobody else wanted, and partly because writing was basically magic to the average person. A scribe could take a thought, freeze it in symbols, and someone centuries later would squint at those symbols and go, ah yes, this is just another inventory of linen bandages. Fascinating. Greek scribes had their own set of problems. They used wax tablets so they could erase mistakes, but wax melts. Picture being an earnest scribe working near a window, the sun inching across the sky, and suddenly half your day's work becoming a tiny puddle of accidental abstract art. Very humbling. In Rome, scribes were everywhere, taking dictation for senators who absolutely insisted they spoke with natural eloquence, even though every sentence they uttered took 9 detours and a philosophical side quest. Some scribes developed a kind of sixth sense for when a speech was about to get longer than intended, and you can imagine the deep sigh that followed. Even their writing tools were moody. Ink could be too thick, too thin, too gritty, too watery. A quill could split at the worst possible moment. And if a scribe sneezed? Well, someone out there now owned a slightly more abstract document than expected. Despite the daily inconveniences, scribes produced the backbone of history. Without them, all we'd have are vague myths, questionable oral traditions, and whatever pottery shards survived being dropped by archaeologists. Instead, we have real records, mundane, repetitive, soothing in their ordinariness. Because while the emperors and kings lived wildly unstable lives, the scribes remained constant, quiet, methodical, a little ink-stained, a little tired, but steady enough to leave behind whole libraries of slow, deliberate writing. Their world reminds us that civilizations aren't built on dramatic speeches or heroic moments. They're built on people who calmly documented how many sheep crossed a bridge in midsummer. And honestly, there's something remarkably peaceful about that. Now, let's wander into the quiet, herb-scented world of medieval apothecaries. These were the people everyone politely admired and occasionally feared, not because they were dangerous, but because their work involved an impressive amount of powdered roots, dried flowers, and mysterious liquids that smelled faintly of vinegar and old dreams. Apothecaries were essentially the original pharmacists, chemists, and part-time worrywarts. Their days were spent grinding, mixing, and labeling small jars of remedies for villagers who couldn't quite remember which ailment required rosemary and which required Well, more rosemary. Their shops were usually cramped, filled with shelves that leaned ever so slightly, jars stacked like careful towers of fragile ambition. Some of the jars were labeled meticulously in Latin. Some were labeled in a sort of shorthand scribbled by an apothecary who had perhaps had one too many cups of bitter herb tea. Everything smelled faintly earthy, slightly dusty, and occasionally like the kind of mistake you don't notice until 2 days later. The patrons didn't mind. It was part of the charm. Apothecaries kept very careful notes. Sometimes those notes were recipes. Sometimes they were warnings to themselves. Do not mix the red powder with anything yellow, or everyone in the village will complain. Occasionally, the warnings were too vague to be of any help, but still satisfying to write. There's a quiet dignity in knowing that even when nothing spectacular happens, you've done your best to prevent mild chaos. Their lives were slow, deliberate, occasionally punctuated by anxious villagers asking whether they had something to cure headaches, melancholy, or excessively dull evenings. The apothecary would nod, sometimes shrug, and provide a small, carefully measured dose, usually more for reassurance than actual medicinal efficacy. Apothecaries also doubled as informal advisors. People came in for cures, stayed for gentle conversation about life, weather, or the condition of last year's barley crop. It was not a dramatic social life. No duels, no conspiracies, just steady presence, herbal aroma, and a quiet insistence that the world could be slightly more manageable if you ground your roots correctly. Some apothecaries were also a little paranoid, perhaps understandably. A spilled jar of something mildly potent could result in angry villagers, which was unpleasant but never truly fatal. And they were meticulous about sanitation, or at least as meticulous as one could be in a world with no running water and an abundance of curious cats. In essence, apothecaries were guardians of minor well-being. They didn't cure wars. They didn't cure heartbreaks. But they managed small discomforts with a gentle hand, and in a sleepy, pre-modern society, that was no small thing. And in their slow, herbal-lit shops, surrounded by the muted ticking of wooden clocks and the soft scrape of mortar against pestle, one could almost feel the rhythm of time itself, steady, predictable, almost hypnotic. A perfect companion for a listener who is already half asleep, allowing their mind to drift from the worries of the day into the comforting hum of quiet diligence. There's no dramatic climax here. Nothing explodes. The jars remain on their shelves. The herbs remain ground. Life continues at a gentle pace. And the apothecary quietly ensures that the world doesn't become completely chaotic, at least in minor ailments, mild anxieties, and dull evenings. Now let's drift into something slightly more colorful, but still gentle, the village feast. Medieval feasts were not dramatic spectacles in the sense of fire-breathing heroes or impromptu duels. They were, instead, extended social experiments in patience, mild embarrassment, and the slow consumption of slightly overcooked food. Imagine a long wooden table set under the open sky, or in a hall with roughly plastered walls and beams that had clearly seen better decades. People sat shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors they saw every day, cousins they were politely avoiding, and the occasional traveling stranger who probably smelled faintly of horse and curiosity. Everyone had something to say. Everyone spoke at the same time. And nobody really listened, which is fine, because the purpose of a feast was not to communicate efficiently, but to exist together in a mildly awkward but socially necessary ritual. Food was central, naturally. Bread, stews, salted meats, cheeses that had a definite character, and vegetables that were sometimes unidentifiable. Serving sizes were generous but inconsistent. Someone would receive enough stew to feed a small battalion, while their neighbor received something that looked suspiciously like a garnish. And yet it didn't matter. People adapted. They passed around bowls with the slow dignity of those who had been doing this for generations. Entertainment was usually subtle. Perhaps a musician plucked at a lute or a flute, producing notes that wavered lazily in the evening air. Sometimes there was dancing, which consisted mostly of awkward shuffling, accidental elbow nudges, and the occasional triumphant spin when someone remembered the steps correctly. No one laughed too loudly. No one shouted. It was all very calm, very communal, very slow. perfect for letting your mind wander in comfortable semi-darkness. Conversations at these feasts were predictably mundane. Discussions of weather, crop yields, which neighbors were slightly disagreeable, and the minor victories of a goat not falling into the river. Arguments rarely escalated. If someone got too loud, the gentle glare of a village elder or the carefully measured nods of the host restored calm. And then there were toasts. Toasts in medieval villages were short, polite, and slightly repetitive. To the harvest. To the harvest. To the health of the baker's cat. The pause. A sip. A soft clink of cups. Everyone knew the ritual, everyone participated, no one got hurt. Children, if present, drifted around the edges of the hall, nibbling bits of bread or cheese, occasionally startling an adult with a small question that could be answered with a polite, distracted nod. Dogs lay nearby, hoping for scraps. The atmosphere was stable, predictable, soothingly ordinary. And yet, in all of this mundane human interaction, there was a subtle rhythm, a gentle ebb and flow of movement, conversation, and the quiet passage of hours. People arrived. They ate. They nodded. They spoke softly. They left. And the feast, like life itself, continued in a cycle that was neither heroic nor tragic. Even the cleaning afterward was remarkably calm. Everyone pitched in, sweeping floors, stacking benches, gathering leftovers. No shouting, no panic. Just steady, patient labor that ensured the hall would be ready for the next socially obligatory gathering. There is something remarkably comforting in that repetition, in the calm social negotiation of minor grievances, in the slow circulation of food, the soft strumming of a lute, and the quiet acknowledgement that life proceeds at its own unhurried pace. In essence, the village feast is a microcosm of human society at its most gentle, imperfect, slightly awkward, but sustained by patience and quiet communal effort. A place where nothing dramatic happens, but everything necessary continues. Let's meander now into the quiet, meditative realm of monastery gardens. These gardens were not chaotic or competitive. They were deliberate, precise, and the perfect environment for monks to practice a form of gentle control over nature, one carefully calculated plant at a time. Monks spent hours planting, pruning, and tending herbs and vegetables. Each plant had its place. Each row followed a careful logic that made perfect sense to someone accustomed to living by the slow rhythm of prayer and daily labor. The garden was a sanctuary, a place of focus, not spectacle. Most of the work involved herbs, which were both practical and symbolic. Sage, thyme, and rosemary, plants that could flavor food, heal minor ailments, or, more importantly, give the impression that someone was doing important, mystical things with tiny leaves. Each sprig had to be trimmed carefully, each seed sown at the correct depth, each watering measured with quiet attention. Too much and the plant sulked. Too little and it withered. Vegetables were a little more forgiving, though not by much. Cabbages, leeks, and beans grew according to their own rhythms, which the monks observed with a sort of mild obsessive fascination. A successful harvest meant enough food to sustain the monastery quietly through another season. A poor harvest meant slightly less comfort, and perhaps a gentle sigh or two from the gardener monks. Flower beds existed mostly to remind visitors that monks had taste and patience, and that beauty could exist without drama. Lavender, marigold, and violets were arranged symmetrically, as if the earth itself were a canvas and the monks were content to make subtle, unhurried brushstrokes. We should note that garden labor was not glamorous. No dramatic tournaments or heroic feats occurred. Instead, time passed slowly, deliberately, punctuated by the occasional bird landing in the herb patch or the distant tolling of a bell. Monks moved quietly, tools in hand, rhythmically maintaining the garden like a slow, breathing organism. Record-keeping was also meticulous. Monks documented planting times, harvest yields, and even subtle notes about weather patterns. A sunny morning might be recorded with mild enthusiasm. An unexpected frost would be noted with gentle regret. Every detail mattered, though the details themselves were entirely unexciting to anyone outside the monastery. And yet, there was satisfaction in this quiet order. The garden offered consistency in a world that could otherwise feel unpredictable. Crops grew, herbs flourished, flowers bloomed. Life moved forward at the slow, unhurried pace the monks had cultivated over decades of patient attention. There is a gentle rhythm in imagining this: rows of plants, tending hands, the occasional fluttering leaf. No shouting, no urgent drama. Just calm work done with care, repeated day after day. Even the garden paths were carefully maintained. Stones placed just so. Edges trimmed. Grass cut evenly. The monastery garden existed as a microcosm of deliberate life, where patience, observation, and routine were more important than anything else. Let's drift now to the coasts, where the rhythm of life depended less on manuscripts or gardens and more on tides, nets, and fish that were only slightly more cooperative than humans. Fishing villages were small, tight-knit communities. Days began early, usually before the sun had fully decided to rise, and ended with the quiet satisfaction of having caught enough to sustain families through another night. Fishing itself was calm in principle, though occasionally unpredictable. Nets were cast into the sea, poles were balanced in hands, and boats drifted gently on the waves. Sometimes fish cooperated, sometimes they did not. And when they didn't, the villagers sighed, readied themselves for another attempt, and reminded one another that tomorrow was another day. The social structure of these villages was equally slow-moving. Elders quietly directed younger fishermen on which tides to follow, which areas of the coast were safest, and how to repair nets with minimal fuss. Children observed and learned at a distance, mostly under the gentle supervision of parents who understood that patience, more than strength or cunning, was the most essential skill in coastal life. Even meals were slow affairs. Fish was smoked, salted, or preserved in brine. Bread was baked in small communal ovens. Vegetables were limited to whatever could survive in small garden plots nearby. No one rushed the preparation. No one fretted about presentation. The goal was sustenance and continuity. Weather dictated a lot of the villagers' moods. Rain or wind could delay a day's work, but the community adapted. Tasks shifted to mending lines, repairing boats, or maintaining storage facilities. No one panicked. They had learned over generations that the sea was patient but exacting. Respect and routine kept life moving steadily. Community rituals were equally slow and gentle. Villagers gathered at small chapels for blessings, or at local crossroads to leave offerings for protection at sea. These acts were not dramatic spectacles, only minor acknowledgments that life was precarious and that the unseen gods, spirits, or simple superstition might assist if reminded politely. Even disputes were handled with calm. Arguments over fishing rights or property lines rarely escalated. A mild word, a measured gesture, or the quiet involvement of a respected elder generally restored order. Everyone understood that cooperation mattered more than winning, because survival depended on steady, collective effort. And perhaps most soothingly, life in these villages moved to the rhythm of the natural world. Tides rose and fell predictably. Seasons came and went with quiet regularity. Fish spawned. Crops were planted and harvested. Villagers, like the millstones, olive trees, and monastery gardens we've wandered among, found a slow, dependable pattern in which their lives could unfold comfortably. There were no grand dramas, no unexpected invasions, no heroic feats. Just steady labor, shared knowledge, and the comforting assurance that, if you respected the sea and the natural rhythms of your environment, life continued, slowly, gently, and with enough predictability to allow for small, contented moments of rest. Let's drift into the quietly bustling world of medieval castle kitchens. These spaces were neither glamorous nor dramatic, but they were essential. Every large household, from modest manor to towering stone fortress, relied on kitchen staff to transform raw ingredients into meals capable of sustaining dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people. And the work moved slowly, steadily, like a river of soundless labor. Kitchens were full of careful, repetitive tasks. Chopping, grinding, stirring, boiling, and baking, all executed with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Apprentices learned by observation, watching the same motions repeated until mastery was absorbed, quietly, without fanfare. Knives were sharpened and maintained. Pots were scrubbed. Fires were tended. Bread was kneaded and baked with patience that only centuries of tradition could enforce. The staff hierarchy was strict but unobtrusive. The head cook oversaw the workflow with calm authority, guiding the assistants with gentle corrections rather than shouting. Everyone had a role. One handled meats, another soups, another baked bread or prepared vegetables. Tasks were assigned, completed, and rotated according to a silent understanding of efficiency rather than urgency. Meals themselves were prepared slowly, emphasizing sustainability over speed. Roasts cooked over the fire for hours. Stews simmered, leaving subtle, fragrant smoke in the air. Herbs were added not in dramatic bursts but measured carefully to balance flavor. Medieval cooks understood that the passage of time was an ingredient in its own right. There were minor challenges, of course. Supplies sometimes ran low. Fires could falter. Sometimes, the household requested an unusual ingredient or an elaborate dish. But even then, solutions were found through careful, methodical effort rather than panic. Adaptation was slow and deliberate, just enough to maintain calm and continuity. Even cleaning and maintenance were carried out with unhurried diligence. Knives, pots, and work surfaces were washed, dried, and stored. Floors were swept. Ashes from hearths were removed carefully. The kitchen ran as a well-ordered ecosystem, in which small failures could be corrected with patience and minimal fuss. The environment had a rhythm all its own. The sizzle of meat on the hearth, the soft thud of loaves being shaped, the gentle crackle of firewood, the faint scent of herbs. It was a space of quiet motion, where each sound, each movement, contributed to a steady, calming flow of activity. Castle kitchens remind us that history is not only made in battles, councils, or courts. It is also made in the quiet, careful work of those who sustain life day after day. Without the steady hands of kitchen staff, grand halls would have been silent and empty, and the people who lived in castles would have been both hungry and less patient. And so, in these kitchens, life continued at its slow, deliberate pace. Nothing dramatic happened. The fires burned steadily. The loaves rose predictably. The staff moved in measured rhythm. And in their quiet labor, they created the conditions for all the more exciting events outside the walls, even though the kitchens themselves remained calm, ordinary, and utterly consistent. Now, let's drift toward the subtle, quietly important world of medieval candle makers. Their craft was neither glamorous nor fast, but it was essential. In a time before electricity, before oil lamps became widespread, candles were the primary source of light after dusk, and making them was a slow, careful, almost meditative process. Candle making required attention and patience. Wicks had to be spun just so. Wax needed to be melted to the right consistency, not too hot, not too cool. If the temperature was off, the candle could crack, drip excessively, or fail to burn evenly. Small mistakes could mean hours of work wasted, but no one panicked. Mistakes were corrected slowly, carefully, because speed was not the goal. Consistency and reliability were. Most candles were made from tallow, which was rendered from animal fat. This process was less glamorous than it sounds. It involved slow heating, careful skimming, and a lot of waiting. Tallow candles smelled faintly of what they were, which villagers tolerated politely because, otherwise, they would sit in darkness. Wealthier households sometimes used beeswax, which produced a cleaner, gentler light, but also required slightly more finesse. Candle makers often worked in small workshops, where the rhythmic clink of dipping wicks into vats of wax created a calm, repetitive soundscape. Apprentices learned to watch and imitate. Adults moved slowly, hands steady, eyes trained on the delicate balance of wax, wick, and time. The work itself enforced quietude. There was no need to rush. The goal was not excitement, but illumination. Once made, candles were stored and sometimes decorated, though not extravagantly. Households relied on them for meals, prayers, and evening gatherings. Candle makers had a quiet pride in their work, knowing that their slow, careful labor enabled others to see, read, cook, or pray safely after dark. Seasonal patterns influenced the work. Winter demanded more production, as nights were longer and darkness arrived early. Summers allowed for maintenance of molds and tools, and for slow experimentation with shapes and sizes. Life moved according to the rhythm of days, months, and the cycles of demand. There were minor mishaps, of course. Candles could bend, crack, or drip excessively. Wax could spill. Wicks could be misaligned. And yet, these were small, correctable problems in a world accustomed to waiting. Patience and repetition were always sufficient remedies. Even the markets where candles were sold maintained this unhurried tone. Villagers would examine them, select them politely, exchange a few words with the maker, and leave without urgency. Candle makers valued these interactions. They reinforced the slow, deliberate pace of life. In essence, candle makers offered more than light. They offered predictability and quiet ritual. In dimly lit homes, families could read, work, or talk softly, all because of these unhurried artisans who respected the passage of time. And so, as the wax hardened and wicks curled into perfection, the world outside might have been loud or unpredictable, but inside the workshops, life continued at a calm, steady pace. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing changed suddenly, and everything remained gentle, repetitive, and reliable. Now, let's wander into the quiet, rhythmic world of medieval coopers. Coopers were the craftsmen who made barrels, casks, and wooden containers, the essential vessels for storing everything from grain to wine to salted fish. Their lives were steady, deliberate, and entirely focused on precision and repetition. Cooperage required patience above all. Each barrel was made from multiple staves, long, curved pieces of wood that had to be shaped and fitted perfectly. Too tight and the wood might split. Too loose and the contents could leak. Coopers measured, shaved, and sanded each stave with meticulous care, often over several days. It was not a race. The satisfaction was in doing it correctly, slowly, and consistently. Metal hoops were fitted around the barrel to hold it together. This task required gentle hammering and careful attention to alignment. Too forceful and the hoop could bend. Too gentle and it might fall off. The cooper learned to trust their hands, to listen to the rhythm of wood and metal, and to move with steady, measured patience. Barrel making was not glamorous. It was noisy in a quiet, methodical way. Soft thuds, gentle scraping, the occasional hiss of steam as wood was bent with water. Apprentices learned to pace themselves, matching the slow cadence of their master's hands and tools. There was no rush, only the steady accumulation of perfectly shaped barrels. Barrels themselves became vital parts of daily life. They stored grain, beer, oil, water, and sometimes more exotic items like spices. A well-made barrel could last decades. A poorly made one might fail after a single winter. This knowledge instilled a sense of calm responsibility in coopers, who understood that their careful work supported the predictable flow of life for an entire community. Even the delivery and placement of barrels followed a slow, deliberate rhythm. Stacked in cellars or along docks, barrels were arranged for stability, accessibility, and long-term storage. Villagers and traders respected this careful planning. Nothing was hurried. Everything was measured and intentional. Coopers also maintained their tools and workspace with patient diligence. Chisels were sharpened. Mallets were inspected. Work surfaces were cleaned and organized. The environment mirrored the work itself, deliberate, methodical, and entirely predictable. There were occasional minor mishaps. A stave might split, a hoop might bend, but these were correctable with patience and a calm hand. No one panicked. Life, much like the barrels themselves, moved steadily forward. The cooper's work reminds us that history is often built in small increments. No grand gestures. No dramatic revelations. Just the repetition of careful, skilled labor, repeated day after day, season after season. Through their steady hands, communities remained supplied, organized, and calm, even as the wider world continued its unpredictable course. Let's turn now to the medieval blacksmith, whose life combined physical labor with rhythmic, almost meditative repetition. Blacksmiths were responsible for producing tools, nails, horseshoes, household implements, and sometimes modest decorative objects. Their work was slow, deliberate, and steady. a craft measured in strikes, heat, and patience. A blacksmith's day began with the preparation of the forge. Coal or charcoal had to be arranged to burn consistently. The bellows were tested, producing a steady stream of air that could be adjusted to regulate the temperature. Too hot, and the iron could warp or crack. Too cool, and shaping it became tedious and frustrating. Precision, patience, and calm observation were essential. Once the metal reached the proper heat, the blacksmith used hammer and anvil in a rhythm that could be mesmerizing. Strike, lift, turn, strike again. Apprentices often learned by observing this slow cadence, gradually internalizing the pattern until it became almost instinctive. Each strike produced a soft, predictable echo through the workshop. Repetition more than speed was the key to success. The work was physically demanding, but not dramatic. Blacksmiths did not leap heroically into battle or perform feats of acrobatic skill in the forge. Instead, they bent, hammered, and shaped iron at a steady pace, allowing the metal to respond slowly and predictably to their careful attention. Every nail, hook, or horseshoe was a quiet accomplishment, made with hands that had become accustomed to the subtle feedback of iron and fire. Minor mishaps were part of the routine. A piece of iron could crack unexpectedly, or a horseshoe might be slightly misshapen. These incidents were rarely urgent crises. They were simply incorporated into the ongoing rhythm of work. Blacksmiths learned to correct mistakes methodically, without haste, and without losing the tranquil focus that defined their craft. The workshop itself was a space of muted activity. Sparks flew in soft showers, the bellows hissed intermittently, and tools clinked against one another. Outside, the village might be bustling or noisy, but inside the forge, a quiet order prevailed. The blacksmith's steady hands and measured strikes created a hypnotic environment, a rhythm both productive and calming. Blacksmiths also maintained their tools and workspace with care. Hammers were inspected, anvils cleaned, tongs arranged meticulously. The environment mirrored the work, consistent, predictable, and quietly orderly. Even apprentices, initially clumsy, gradually adopted this rhythm, finding comfort in the repetition. Their work, though essential, was quietly heroic in its reliability. A village's economy, mobility, and daily life depended on sturdy iron goods. Without the blacksmith's careful, repetitive labor, life would have been slower, less organized, and slightly less predictable. And in this gentle, repetitive forge of daily life, there is a subtle lesson. History is not only made in grand battles or royal proclamations. It is also made in the quiet persistence of skilled hands, moving rhythmically through fire, metal, and routine. Now, let's wander into the calm, methodical world of medieval weavers. These craftsmen and craftswomen spent their days immersed in threads, looms, and patterns that required patience, precision, and a remarkable tolerance for repetition. Life in the weaving workshop was steady, quiet, and almost hypnotic, perfect for slowly lulling the mind into a gentle haze. Weaving was an exercise in rhythm. Warp threads were carefully stretched across the loom, tension adjusted, and shuttle passed repeatedly through the threads. Each movement followed predictably from the last. Strike, pass, beat, lift. Over and over, hour after hour. The monotony was deliberate, soothing, and essential to producing strong, even fabric. Cloth production demanded attention to detail. A single misaligned thread could create an imperfection in the fabric, but errors were corrected methodically, without urgency. There was no need for speed. Consistency mattered far more. The gentle clack of shuttle against warp, the soft scraping of loom parts, and the occasional whisper of thread rubbing against wood created a calming, almost meditative soundscape. Weavers often worked in small workshops or communal spaces. Apprentices learned slowly, observing their teachers and gradually internalizing the careful motions required to produce high-quality cloth. Conversation was minimal, often limited to polite instruction or the quiet discussion of patterns and materials. Noise was rare, because focus was paramount and disruption unwelcome. Materials varied according to region and wealth. Linen, wool, and sometimes silk, each with its own temperament. Linen was steady and reliable. Wool could be unpredictable, requiring gentle coaxing. Silk demanded delicacy, careful guidance, and almost reverential patience. The weaver learned to read the character of the material, adjusting movements and rhythm to suit the subtle resistance of threads under hand and foot. Dyeing, spinning, and finishing were equally slow, deliberate processes. Threads were dyed in small vats, colors measured and blended patiently, and then dried in controlled conditions. Finished fabric was rolled, stored, and eventually distributed or sold. Each step reinforced the overarching rhythm of slow, careful, predictable labor. Even the social side of weaving was calm. Weavers occasionally shared knowledge or recipes for dyes, exchanged yarn, or offered gentle advice to apprentices. Disputes were minimal, easily corrected with quiet instruction rather than conflict. The workshop was a space of order, repetition, and quiet mastery, where the day unfolded predictably and minor mistakes could always be corrected without drama. And so, in weaving as in so many of the other crafts we've observed, blacksmithing, coopering, candle making, castle kitchens, there is a quiet satisfaction in rhythm, repetition, and patience. Life moves slowly, steadily, and predictably, as thread follows thread, hour follows hour, and human hands maintain a calm, gentle order over the materials they touch. Let's drift into the soft, deliberate world of medieval librarians. These were the custodians of knowledge, tasked with preserving manuscripts, scrolls, and early codices long before the invention of the printing press. Their lives were unhurried, filled with quiet observation, careful handling of fragile materials, and an almost meditative attention to detail. The work of a librarian involved cataloging, copying, and repairing texts. Every manuscript had its place on the shelf, and every scroll was carefully rolled, labeled, and stored. Mistakes were not catastrophic, but they were inconvenient. Misplacing a text could disrupt study or ritual. So librarians worked slowly and methodically, prioritizing precision over speed. Copying texts was a particularly quiet and repetitive task. Scribes, often part of the librarian's staff, would write each letter carefully, ink flowing steadily onto parchment or vellum. The sound of quill on surface was soft, punctuated occasionally by a gentle cough or the faint rustle of turning pages. Hours passed without dramatic events, but the work accumulated, ensuring that knowledge persisted for future generations. Repairing manuscripts required patience. Torn pages were mended with thin strips of vellum, fragile bindings were reinforced, and faded ink was sometimes traced carefully. Each action demanded slow, deliberate motions, minimizing the risk of further damage. It was laborious, yes, but oddly calming. One could almost fall asleep listening to the gentle scratching of quills and the faint crackle of parchment. Medieval libraries were quiet spaces, designed to encourage focus and preserve fragile collections. Light was limited to soft natural sunlight or candles, carefully monitored to avoid harming delicate pages. Librarians moved slowly, both to protect the texts and to maintain an atmosphere of calm. Even footsteps were soft, measured, as if the very floorboards understood that this was a sanctuary of stillness. There was social interaction, but it was subdued. Scholars visited to consult specific texts, requesting access politely and returning materials promptly. Librarians guided them with quiet explanations and gentle reminders, rarely raising their voices. The work required patience, a steady hand, and a calm mind. The daily rhythm of a librarian's life was predictable. Morning light revealed dusty shelves. Quills were prepared, inkwells filled. Pages were examined, copied, and stored. Candles were lit in the evening for continued work. Books were preserved. Knowledge was safeguarded. The world outside might be noisy or unpredictable, but inside the library, time moved slowly, predictably, gently. Even the preservation of knowledge itself reinforced this slow pace. Materials degraded over decades, requiring constant vigilance. Each task was small, careful, and repetitive, but collectively, the work ensured that ideas, stories, and records survived beyond individual lifetimes. Medieval librarians exemplify the quiet endurance of history. Nothing dramatic occurred. No battles were fought within these walls. No empires were built on the work of a single librarian. And yet, The continuity of civilization often rested, subtly and patiently, on these slow, deliberate routines. Let's drift into the calm, rhythmic world of medieval millers and their apprentices. These were the people responsible for grinding grain into flour, a task that might seem mundane, but which required steady hands, patience, and a quiet respect for the slow machinery that powered their days. A mill was a place of rhythm. Whether water-driven, wind-powered, or turned by human hands, the millstones rotated steadily, grinding grain into flour in a slow, predictable cadence. The apprentice's job was to maintain this rhythm, adjusting stones, adding grain, and ensuring that the output remained consistent. Precision mattered more than speed, and patience was rewarded with uniform, fine flour. Apprentices learned gradually. They observed their masters, noting the subtle vibrations of the stones, the gentle flow of water, and the weight of each sack of grain. Over time, they internalized the soft, constant motion of the mill, moving in harmony with the turning stones and the ebbing flow of energy that powered them. The work was physically steady, but not frantic. Grain was poured, ground, collected, and bagged. Equipment was cleaned, repaired, and maintained with care. Spilled grain was a minor nuisance, easily corrected with a sweep of the broom. Every action contributed to the slow, satisfying accumulation of a day's work. Social interactions in the mill were minimal but polite. Apprentices communicated softly with the miller, asking questions or reporting minor issues. Villagers arrived quietly to collect their flour, exchanging brief words and small courtesies. The environment encouraged calm, focus, and careful attention to routine. Weather and seasons influenced the pace. Rain swelled rivers, increasing water flow and speeding mills slightly, though adjustments were always made slowly. Drought slowed the wheels, requiring patience and careful measurement. The miller's apprentice learned to adapt, matching their movements to the gentle, fluctuating rhythm of natural forces. Even the sensory experience of the mill contributed to its calming effect. The low rumble of stone on grain, the soft creak of wooden gears, the faint scent of flour dust in the air. It was a workspace alive with gentle motion, predictable sounds, and soothing repetition. The life of a miller's apprentice demonstrates the quiet endurance of human labor. Nothing dramatic happens. No battles rage here. No dynasties rise or fall. And yet, the steady work of grinding grain sustained communities, regulated daily life, and created a subtle, continuous rhythm that tied people to the gentle cycles of nature. In this soft, patient environment, apprentices absorbed more than just skills. They absorbed a sense of time, order, and calm that would guide them throughout their lives. And even if the world beyond the mill was chaotic, inside this space, the rotation of stones and the flow of grain dictated a predictable, unhurried pace that was quietly comforting. Now, let's drift into the softly hypnotic world of medieval potters. These craftsmen and craftswomen shaped clay into bowls, jugs, plates, and other everyday objects. Their work was rhythmic, deliberate, and perfectly suited to a slow, meditative pace. The day in a pottery workshop began with clay preparation. Clay had to be kneaded and wedged to remove air bubbles and achieve a smooth consistency. This was slow, tactile work, hands pressing, folding, and turning the clay again and again. The repetitive motion, coupled with the soft, earthy smell of wet clay, created a calming, grounded environment. Shaping the clay on the wheel was equally rhythmic. The potter's hands guided the spinning form carefully, applying pressure in measured doses. Too much force and the piece would collapse. Too little and it wouldn't rise as intended. Every motion was deliberate, producing a soothing repetition as the clay yielded obediently beneath patient hands. Apprentices learned slowly, starting with small forms like cups or simple bowls. Over time, they mastered larger vessels, more complex shapes, and subtle decorative touches. Conversation was minimal in the workshop. Teachers demonstrated once, then apprentices repeated the motions quietly until muscle memory took over. Observation and practice were the key lessons. Firing the pottery was another slow, deliberate process. Kilns were carefully loaded, fuel measured, and temperatures monitored with steady hands. Pottery spent hours transforming in heat, emerging solid, durable, and ready for daily life. No dramatic explosions or instant results, just quiet patience rewarded with reliability. Pottery workshops were fragrant, dusty, and rhythmic. The soft hum of the wheel, the occasional thump of a clay piece being moved, and the gentle scraping of tools combined to form an environment that was almost hypnotic. Mistakes were minor, a bowl might warp, a handle might break, but these were simply opportunities for repetition, learning, and calm correction. Potters also served the community. Their work, though subtle, was essential. Food had to be stored, liquids had to be poured, meals had to be served. The steady, repetitive craft of shaping and firing clay supported daily life, quietly reinforcing rhythm, routine, and reliability. Social interactions in pottery workshops were minimal but polite. Apprentices and masters communicated softly, and villagers visited to select functional wares. Nothing was rushed. Sales, discussions, and transactions were gentle, deliberate, and slow, just like the work itself. The life of a medieval potter exemplifies the soothing consistency of skilled, patient labor. Time passes slowly, hands move rhythmically, and the day accumulates quietly productive results. There is no dramatic heroism, no sudden change, just the calm, continuous unfolding of effort and creation. Now let's wander into the quietly focused world of medieval shoemakers. These craftsmen and craftswomen spent their days shaping leather into boots, shoes, sandals, and occasionally more ornamental footwear. Their lives were rhythmic, deliberate, and guided by steady hands, patience, and careful attention to detail. Shoemaking began with selecting and preparing leather. Hides were softened, scraped, and sometimes tanned to achieve the right consistency. Each piece had its own subtle characteristics, and the shoemaker had to respond accordingly, pressing, cutting, and molding with care. Too aggressive, and the leather would tear. Too hesitant, and it would resist forming correctly. The work demanded gentle observation and consistent repetition. Next came measuring and cutting patterns. Foot dimensions were taken carefully, often with modest tools like wooden sticks or string. Patterns were transferred to leather, then cut with knives or shears. Each motion was deliberate, precise, and quiet. Apprentices watched carefully, learning not just the technique, but the patience necessary to ensure that every shoe would fit reliably and last for years. Assembly was slow. Pieces were stitched together, sometimes with awl and thread, sometimes with nails or pegs. Hands moved rhythmically, creating a repetitive cadence that could almost lull the mind into gentle relaxation. Shoemakers learned to read the resistance of leather and adjust accordingly, a subtle interplay of skill, observation, and calm focus. The final shaping and finishing required similar patience. Soles were attached, edges trimmed, and surfaces polished. Occasionally, minor imperfections had to be corrected, but nothing was rushed. Every adjustment was made deliberately, reinforcing the soothing, steady pace of the workshop. Shoemaking workshops were modestly fragrant, leather, wax, and occasional tints of dye filled the air. Tools clinked softly, scissors cut quietly, and the gentle tap of nails or awl added a subtle rhythm to the space. Apprentices often practiced silently, absorbing not only technique but the unhurried cadence of the craft itself.